The doors of Greystone Hollow had been locked for years, but that night when the wind began to scream without cause, and the old bell wire rang by itself, someone turned the key from the inside. Only it wasn't someone living. It was on a suffocating, airless July evening when Miss Evelyn Blackthorne first stepped into the forgotten heart of Thornwick Grange, a once imposing Edwardian estate now broken into crumbling flats, its grandeur drowned by ivy-choked walls and the heavy rot of forgotten time. The house didn't breathe. It brooded, like an old mind festering in its memories. Her room, modest and sparse, looked out upon a desolate garden where a crooked sundial stood surrounded by creeping moss, and the skeletal remains of wild roses now blackened and dead. The tenants, like shadows, moved with a kind of numb detachment, each a ghost of their former lives. But it was Elira Moore, a woman with translucent skin and the haunted gaze of someone long tormented by unspoken memories, who caught Evelyn's quiet attention. One night, as they sat by the decaying hearth, where damp curled up the walls and the wallpaper peeled like dead skin, Elira leaned in, voice barely above a whisper, her cup trembling in her hands. "There's something wrong with this house," she said, her eyes flickering toward the door as if expecting it to open on its own. "At night, through the walls a voice, it keeps saying the same thing over and over. It wasn't suicide." Evelyn did not recoil. She had heard stranger things than ghosts, and often found the truth was not in what people said, but in what the world refused to forget. "How curious," she murmured, her fingers idly brushing a crack in the hearth. In the nights that followed, Elira's pallor worsened. Her cheeks grew hollow, and dark crescents hung beneath her eyes like bruises left by dreams. She confessed the voice had grown clearer, more insistent. It now whispered. The key was in her hand. She abandoned her bedroom entirely, roaming the halls in nervous loops, her steps frantic but soft, like someone hoping not to wake something. The other tenants scoffed. Miss Galloway, pickled daily in her beloved sherry, blamed Gothic novels and hysteria. Mr. Beckett, stiff and mechanical, muttered about plumbing and refused to entertain nonsense. But Evelyn, observant and ever composed, began walking the corridors just after dusk, listening for more than footsteps, listening to the silences between sounds, to the way certain corners seemed to breathe when no one was there. The house was not merely old, it was wounded, its walls saturated with echoes not yet finished speaking. And then, one night, Elira stopped Evelyn in the hallway, her voice shaking as she said what she'd heard most recently. She didn't jump, she was pushed. Evelyn hesitated, just a moment, then clutched her knitting bag to her chest, and muttered almost to herself, "How terribly inconvenient it must be for the dead to speak when the living have chosen so completely to forget." In the drawing room, where a faded portrait of a sharp-eyed woman still watched over a neglected fireplace, the name Lady Celestine Harrow was barely spoken aloud anymore, yet the bones of the house had not abandoned her. Through quiet tea-time conversations with the vicar's wife and lingering questions asked in tones of harmless curiosity, Evelyn pieced together the forgotten threads. 5 years ago, Lady Harrow had been discovered dead in the garden, her hands folded and a glass vial clutched in her palm. "Suicide," they said. But whispers spoke differently. Some remembered how unusually calm she'd been that day. Others mentioned bruises hidden under her sleeves, and an abrupt dismissal of her maid just a week before without explanation. Evelyn knew then that the house wasn't haunted by illusion. It was heavy with truth left unspoken. The voice wasn't madness. It was memory breaking through the plaster, a desperate truth clawing upward from beneath rotting floorboards. Thornwick Grange had buried more than just its past. It had sealed away a crime. And Evelyn, with her quiet resolve and steel-lined heart, made herself a promise. She would listen where others would not, and when the house finally screamed, she would be there to make sure the world heard. Morning had barely unfurled its pale light across the frost-veiled windows of Whitwell Manor, when Miss Elowen Greaves, with her quiet intuition and unshakable calm, sensed something beneath the surface had shifted, not a creak of timber or a settling of age-old stone, but a disturbance in the very character of the house, like breath held too long. The silence had texture, thick and uneasy, as if the air itself were listening. Even the clock in the West Hall, known for its reliable chime, stood still at 3:17, its pendulum frozen mid-swing. In the dining room, the polished teapot reflected only absence, and the chair nearest the hearth sat undisturbed, its cushion not bearing the usual imprint of its occupant. It was Miss Lorna Hale, pale, precise, and known for her unnerving habit of murmuring names in her sleep, who had vanished. A woman not given to flights of fancy, but lately prone to whispering strange things to Aloan, when no one else was around, names that didn't belong to anyone alive, numbers she claimed were never meant to be counted, and symbols she'd drawn shakily on napkins before burning them. By noon, her absence was no longer a curiosity, it became a wound in the house's rhythm. Her bedroom, located at the end of the oldest corridor, remained too perfect, the bed unwrinkled, the wardrobe doors tightly shut, and her perfume lingering unnaturally in the air, as if someone had tried to preserve the illusion of presence. On her writing desk, beside a half-melted candle and a dried rose petal, lay a torn sheet of stationery, the paper unevenly ripped and damp at the corners, as if clutched too hard by trembling fingers. Her delicate scrawl, pressed in hurried ink, read, "He told me to stop, warned me not to open it again. But it's not just dreams. If I disappear, find the red file, it's buried under the chapel floor, tell no one until you do." The rest was gone, violently torn away, the missing portion like a breath cut short. Aloan read the note thrice, her expression unreadable, then folded it silently into the pages of her diary, and tucked it beneath her. She said nothing to the others, not yet. She knew these walls too well, they favored silence, and truth she had learned, traveled better in whispers. Over the next few days, Whitwell changed. The manor did not grieve, it recoiled. Lady Belvedere no longer wandered the garden in her ivory shawl, instead taking tea alone, her eyes flicking nervously to shadows that hadn't moved. Miss Hawthorne, the estate solicitor, visited far too often under the excuse of property valuations, yet spent hours in the attic, where no records were kept. The servants, once chatty, now walked in pairs, heads down, as if afraid to catch the attention of something unseen. Even the dogs, once carefree, refused to enter the eastern wing. Aloan noted it all, including the subtle way Reverend Mallory avoided the old well, the very place Lorna once claimed she heard music, notes that didn't belong to any earthly tune. Then came the oddities, the firewood stacked differently each morning, a single glove left outside her door with no matching pair, and the mirror in the drawing room which had begun fogging from within. Aloan waited until dusk to return to the chapel, a neglected stone ruin with ivy-choked walls and a cracked bell tower. No one had entered since the war. Inside, the floorboards were warped, but beneath the altar, her boots found a hollow echo. She pried open the rotting boards with a rusted fire poker, and uncovered a narrow crawlspace filled with mildew and stale air, and at its center, wrapped in oilcloth and bound in crimson ribbon, was the red file. As her lantern flickered against the crypt-stained stone, she saw it was marked with the same sigil that once adorned Lorna's secret ring, an Ouroboros swallowing its own tail, encircled by 5 crescent moons. With shaking hands she opened it. Inside were letters dating back to 1872, each signed in the same looping hand despite spanning nearly a century, and photographs of people who should not have known each other, standing together in impossible timelines. And there on the final page was a list, 10 names. 8 were crossed out. One was Lorna Hale. The last was Aloan Greaves. A coldness rose from the floor, curling up her spine like breath on the nape of her neck. She realized this wasn't a mystery that began with Lorna's disappearance. It was a ritual, repeated every generation, buried and reburied with careful precision, and now, Aloan had become part of it. As the chapel door creaked slowly shut behind her, despite the stillness of the wind, she finally understood. Lorna hadn't disappeared. She had been taken, and something in the house was already deciding who would be next. It was just past midnight when the soft thud echoed from the east corridor of Blackthorn Grange, a sound so subtle it might have been dismissed by any ordinary ear as the moaning of timber in an old house. But Elsbeth Dorrell, sharp widowed, and long past believing in coincidences, froze mid-sip, her teacup trembling slightly in her aged hand. The room around her seemed to inhale, the velvet curtains billowing though no windows were open, and the flames in the hearth flickering sideways as if something had passed unseen. Her eyes, sharp as ever despite their age, rose to meet the portrait above the mantel, Lady Thalia Blackthorne, whose expression had always unsettled guests, her painted eyes too knowing, too present. Tonight, under the low golden light of the dying fire, it seemed Lady Thalia's mouth had curved, only slightly but undeniably, into a smirk. That wasn't the first strange thing this week. The clocks throughout the house had begun ticking out of sync, some faster, some slower, but always eerily in rhythm during the darkest hours. The mirror in the hallway, once antique and cracked with time, now reflected rooms Elsbeth hadn't walked into, places she remembered being bricked off decades ago after the birth of the stillborn Blackthorne heir, whose name was stricken from all family records. On Tuesday, she'd awoken to find rose petals on the landing, a flower that hadn't grown in the estate gardens since 1911, the year Rosalie vanished. Everyone in the village still whispered about the little girl with porcelain skin and violet eyes, how she'd walked into her birthday party and vanished before the cake was cut, leaving behind nothing but a soft lullaby echoing in the corridors. Elsbeth had thought it nonsense, village superstition, but then came the note. A brittle piece of parchment slid under her door in the early morning, blank on one side, but when held near the firelight revealed a message burned into the paper itself. She is waking, beneath the nursery, beneath the breath of roses. That phrase, it gripped her heart in a cold fist. No one alive knew what had been buried beneath the nursery, not even the groundskeepers who refused to enter that part of the house after dusk. But Elsbeth, driven by a mix of fear and obligation, had taken the key, an ancient iron thing shaped like a serpent biting its tail, from the locket of her late husband and descended the servants' stairwell behind the library. There, behind a rotted tapestry, she discovered a locked panel carved with the same rose and thorn motif she'd once seen stitched into Rosalie's childhood dress. The key turned with a groan, revealing a space choked with dust and age. Within it, a child's cot, still intact, surrounded by blackened dolls, their faces smeared with soot as though they'd been scorched in some forgotten fire. And at the center of the cot lay a bundle of fabric. Elsbeth, heart thundering, unfolded it with trembling hands, and found within a second note, fresher ink still glossy. She remembers you, the house does too. As she looked up, the candle flame bent sharply, as though recoiling from something behind her, and she caught, in the mirror nailed to the wall above the cot, a figure standing just behind her, small, barefoot, with violet eyes and a mouth that did not smile, only stared. She turned swiftly, but nothing was there. Or rather, there was nothing visible. But the air now smelled faintly of lavender and burnt sugar. That night, the winds outside howled without rest, and every door in the house unlatched and opened in unison at exactly 2:13 a.m., as though summoned. Elsbeth understood now. Rosalie had never truly left, not in body, and certainly not in spirit. Something had anchored her here, a sorrow so old and twisted it had fused with the bones of the house itself. Blackthorne Grange was not haunted, it was inhabited, possessed by memory and mourning, its walls pulsing like veins with secrets long suppressed. And now, after decades of silence and cover-up, of brick doors and false renovations, the past was coming undone, leaking through plaster and paint, and Elsbeth feared that whatever had been hidden beneath the nursery was not just a child's ghost, but something darker, something ancient, something that remembered being forgotten. And tonight, as the floorboards groaned under phantom weight and the nursery door slowly creaked open with no hand to push it, she realized that she was no longer investigating a mystery, she had stepped into it. Something in Coldmere Hall refused to stay buried. Not the ivy that clawed up its crumbling exterior, nor the secrets tucked in the marrow of its walls which whispered when no one was listening. The villagers called it a place left by time, but time had not left, it had lingered, curled like mist in the halls watching. Miss Halwyn, with her grey gloves and unreadable eyes, had returned to Coldmere not for the ledger she claimed, but for the question that had festered in her memory for over 20 years, what truly happened to Corinne Allerton. Her visit to Dr. Thorne was cloaked in politeness and garden talk, yet each word she uttered had the precision of a scalpel. The doctor, his smiles practiced, his hands restless, spoke of Corinne's fragile state, a tendency toward melancholia, the phrases so lifeless, they might have been lifted from an old obituary. But when Miss Halwyn mentioned the word inquest, a tiny involuntary twitch passed through his cheek. It was ruled suicide, he said, fingers drumming the table as if hoping rhythm could distract from the truth. Though the bruises, those were unfortunate. Then he added, almost absently, her uncle wanted the matter handled quietly. The word hung there, thick and pungent quietly, like dust smothering a scream. That evening, Miss Halwyn lit a candle in her room, the gas lamp having flickered itself out twice already, and examined the scorched photograph again. Corinne's face, half preserved through the fire, looked not haunted but alert, as if she knew something. Behind her, a mirror reflected a man in shadow. He wore no expression, only presence. That same night, Evelyn Maddox, sharp, bold and proudly skeptical, stumbled down the corridor, the color drained from her cheeks. Her usual bravado was gone. She clutched the stair rail with trembling fingers and hissed. It said my name. From the walls, it said, "Tell them what you saw." Her voice was cracked raw like something had screamed through her. Miss Halwyn, summoned by the noise, arrived to find Evelyn collapsed by the baseboard, eyes wide, muttering. It was clearer this time. Closer. Word spread by dawn. The villagers whispered about Evelyn's episode, and even those who scoffed at spirits paused before walking alone in the dark. In Miss Halwyn's mind, fear of ghosts was rarely precise. It blurred, swelled, clung. But this fear was sharp, pointed, like a memory resurfacing with teeth. The next afternoon, Reverend Price, once lucid, now frayed, wandered into the vestry where Miss Halwyn waited, pretending to examine a hymnal. His fingers trailed the spines of prayer books as he murmured, "It was that spring. She came to me, Corinne, pale, but defiant. She said she saw someone standing in the West Wing window, a man who had no reflection, who watched her while the house slept. They'll say I'm mad," she said, "but I know what I saw. Please don't let them lock me away." He paused, blinking hard. She cried. Then she left. The next week she was gone. His voice cracked on the last word like a bone splitting. Miss Halwyn did not speak. Instead she touched the brass key hidden in her coat pocket, ornate, ancient, marked with the Allerton crest, and remembered where she'd found it, wedged in a hollow behind the fireplace, wrapped in cloth that smelled of laudanum and mold. That evening she crept alone to the West Wing, the one sealed since Corinne's death. The lock surrendered with a reluctant groan. Inside was dust, yes, but more. A dollhouse on the windowsill, identical to the hall itself, contained miniature furniture, tiny glassware, and in the upper bedroom, a doll, head turned toward the window, a pin lodged through its chest. The real window rattled though there was no wind. A low, unnatural breath swept through the chamber. Miss Halwyn turned slowly. On the wall behind her, words had appeared, drawn in soot, or ash, or something older. "I saw him too." And in that moment, she realized the house was not merely haunted by death. It was inhabited by a lie so deep it had rooted into the floorboards, the pipes, the very stones. Corinne hadn't gone mad, she'd seen something she was never meant to see. And now, whatever she had witnessed, whatever had followed her to that final quiet room, had begun to wake again, not as a ghost, but as vengeance sharpened by silence, ready to speak through anyone who'd once turned away. There had always been something unfinished about the east wing of Windermere House, not ruined, not even neglected, but left in a state of strange pause, as if time had once stood still there, and no one dared to ask why. The wallpaper peeled like old secrets, and the hearth hadn't been lit in nearly 20 years, yet Mrs. Drycott, the long-serving housekeeper, with eyes sharper than most remembered, had murmured just days ago over the breakfast tray that she had smelled smoke, not the comforting kind from oak logs, but the bitter tinge of scorched paper laced with something floral, like rosewater gone stale. Miss Ellery, seated beside the cold teapot and bland toast, had merely nodded at the remark, but her mind had begun to stir. She had heard whispers, not just metaphorical ones but real ones, leaking from the past like water through old stone. Giles Everdon, long since dismissed as sensitive and sickly, had once spoken in his fever of a woman crying, a voice urgent, strangled, begging not to be silenced, followed by a man's reply, curt and controlled, but Giles could never recall whose voice it was. Only the desperation had stayed with him, as if the woman had screamed directly into his bones. And so Miss Ellery waited until the house had exhaled into its evening silence, the staff retired, the rooms settled, and the night resumed its slow, measured rhythm. She crept to the far corridor, where the air hung heavier, stepped into the servants' wing, where even dust moved cautiously, and approached the disused hearth. The scent was still there, faint, but sharp, as though whatever had been hidden was reluctant to vanish completely. She crouched beside the cold iron grate, careful not to disturb more than necessary, and found the ashes still warm beneath the top layer. Among the scorched debris were shreds of thick parchment, wax residue hardened into red-black puddles, and a curl of gold leaf that clung to the blackened paper like memory clings to guilt. One fragment showed part of a lion crest, twisted with thistle, the Hawthorne family seal, and beside it, she unearthed a brittle twist of maroon ribbon, half melted but unmistakable, the same that had adorned Lady Vivienne Hawthorne's private correspondences. And there it was, the edge of a document too important to burn clean. Addendum to the estate of Vivienne Hawthorne, followed by a faint, looping name just barely legible through the soot. Josephine E. Ray. Miss Ellery's heart paused. Josephine, the quiet companion, who had vanished without word or trace, 2 days after Vivienne's funeral, presumed to have left for family abroad, though no address had ever been confirmed. But this wasn't mere sentiment, this was legal, and damning. She turned the page carefully, finding the date, March 12, 1939, 3 months before Vivienne's fatal fall from the observatory staircase. The will bore Vivienne's distinctive hand, sharp, practiced and deliberate. And though most had been consumed by flame, enough remained to make it clear. Josephine was to inherit the West Gardens, a monthly stipend, and personal effects to be transferred discreetly. It had been signed, witnessed, and sealed, and someone had tried to erase it. But why? Miss Ellery knew too well. Some documents are burned for discretion, others for fear, and a rare few for survival. She rose, brushed soot from her skirt, and moved toward the old writing desk in Vivienne's study. Sealed since her death, not by the family, but by Mr. Fenwick, the village solicitor, whose obsession with protocol made him a perfect accomplice to quiet betrayal. Inside the desk, she pried open a warped panel long ignored, and there, wrapped in faded green silk, was a skeleton key, its metal etched with the same crest as the one in the ashes. Miss Ellery recognized it at once. The mausoleum key, thought lost. That night, beneath a moon broken by clouds, and the flicker of lantern light, she descended the chapel steps toward the family crypt. The mausoleum smelled of cold earth, and unopened truths. Beneath the altar slab, behind a rusted grate, she found a tin strongbox sealed in wax. The contents inside were untouched by flame. A letter from Vivienne, written in ink steady and unafraid. "If you find this, you must understand," it began. The pages outlined altered records, a second will tampered with, and a warning. He walks without a sound, leaves no trace, but watches every room. He knows where everything ends. The letter closed with a list of items buried beneath the east garden, things too dangerous to speak of. Miss Ellery stood still for a long time. She understood now. Josephine hadn't fled, she'd been removed, and the voice behind the wall was not madness. It was not memory. It was the last gasp of truth, trying to find a way back into the world. And now, it had. There was an unnatural stillness that cloaked the west corridor of Helberg Grange, not simply the stillness of age or neglect, but something that felt alive in its silence, like a breath held just before a scream, a pause too long after a name has been spoken aloud in the dark. The manor had changed hands over the years, its walls repainted and floors revarnished, but the bones of the place remembered, and what they remembered had not been forgiven. Miss Verity Ashcombe, a reserved woman with a historian's eye and a grief she had never fully learned to wear, arrived at the estate not through inheritance nor purchase but by the pull of something older, A letter left on her doorstep in the rain, unsigned, yellowed at the edges, sealed with wax, bearing a symbol she recognized, not from family photos, but from the margins of an old parish ledger she'd once glimpsed while helping her aunt catalogue the dead. Inside the envelope was a brass key bound with lavender thread, and a single line in faded ink. She waits in the room where no one knocks. The moment she stepped through the arched threshold of Helberg Grange, the air pressed against her like a memory trying to return. Faint whispers riding the draught that curved along the corridor, catching in her collar, tugging at something buried deep within her blood. The manor had long been divided into flats, tenants rotating like seasons, never staying long, always leaving with more silence than they came with, and the east wing had been closed for years following what was only referred to in hushed tones as the incident. No details were offered, only glances exchanged. Verity, drawn not by curiosity, but by a gnawing sense of recognition she could not place, wandered the manor's lesser-used paths, staircases that twisted without symmetry, alcoves with scorched corners, windows that seemed to reflect rooms that didn't exist. It was on the second evening, as the grandfather clock struck 10, and the power flickered for the third night in a row, that she noticed it. A peculiar patch in the wallpaper behind the linen closet, where the floral pattern faltered and the scent of lavender turned sharply metallic. A section of woodwork, slightly warmer than the rest, responded to pressure. The key slid into a slot hidden beneath a rosette carving. With a click that echoed louder than it should have, the wall released, revealing a narrow stone passage spiraling downward, each step coated in dust, disturbed not by time but by something more recent, as though someone else had walked there just days before. At the bottom lay a forgotten chamber, windowless and sealed in silence, its walls lined with faded portraits turned backward as if ashamed to witness. In the center stood a velvet chair bolted to the floor, and beside it, a trunk covered in wax seals and leather straps, one broken as if someone had tried, recently, to force it open. Inside the trunk was a journal wrapped in oilcloth, its pages delicate but legible. It belonged to Lady Celestine Rosendale herself. The entries began orderly, documenting estate matters, but slowly unraveled into frenzied confessions of a child conceived not in scandal but in shadows, hidden not out of shame, but to protect bloodlines and power. A child raised under another name, unaware of the legacy that pulsed in her veins. The name was never written, but Verity knew. Every line pointed to her. Her mother's fragmented stories, her unexplained inheritance of a birthmark matching the Rosendale crest, the dreams, the key, everything she'd dismissed as coincidence, now formed a pattern too precise to ignore. The final journal entry read, "She must never find the Crimson Room. If she does, the house will remember, and remembering will wake what we buried." Just then, the floorboards above creaked with slow, deliberate weight. Verity, journal in hand, rose slowly and turned toward the stair. A whisper curled down the passage, soft but crystalline. "You were never supposed to return." It was a voice not unfamiliar, and not quite living. The crimson door she had passed on her way in, sealed and shrouded in cobwebs, now stood ajar, and beyond it, something moved with the careful patience of something that had waited a very, very long time. The air pulsed as if the house itself had drawn a breath. Verity stepped forward, not with fear, but with the terrible certainty that the blood in her veins had begun to hum in harmony with the floorboards, the walls, the very heartbeat of Helberg Grange. She had not come here to uncover a mystery. She had been summoned by it. Mrs. Winifred Ellery had always been a woman of precise habits: porridge at 7, tea at 4, and her bedroom door opened no more than 4 inches whenever night noises stirred. But on this particular autumn night, as wind scraped like nails across the panes of Rosewood House, she broke her routine, drawn by a shuffling sound in the corridor that did not belong to the creak of the old floorboards or the wheeze of ancient pipes. The hallway, dimly lit by a single sconce that flickered with uncertain flame, held nothing but the scent of lavender polish, and something subtler, damp wool or perhaps old fear. She opened her door just enough to glimpse Mr. Halverson, the reclusive scholar in flat 3, who had always walked like a man carrying too many secrets. Tonight, his face was pale and damp, and his slippers whispered against the floor like apologies. When his eyes met hers, he faltered, hand trembling as it found the banister for balance. Bad plumbing, he mumbled, eyes darting toward the sealed stairwell that led nowhere, or so they were told. No one had used it in decades, not since the collapse. He turned quickly, retreating into his room, but his light remained on well past 3, casting restless shadows through the frosted glass like figures pacing in silence. Mrs. Ellery resumed her knitting, but her needles moved without purpose, her mind circling the memory of a whisper, not imagined, not hallucinated, but directed with weight and clarity, like a voice trying not to be overheard. By morning, the air in the house felt heavier, thick with unspoken dread. Later that day, when the rain had turned the garden to a swamp, and the house seemed to lean just slightly more to one side, the panel behind the old larder, disguised by decades of paint and shelving, was discovered by the maid, who had reached for a jar, and found the wall give way with a reluctant groan. Behind it, a passage lay hidden, narrow as a coffin, and lined with crumbling plaster, just wide enough for someone thin, or desperate. Mrs. Ellery, joined by the parish warden she'd summoned with quiet insistence, stepped into the dark corridor, guided by the uncertain beam of a hand torch. The air was still but not empty. It held a scent like iron and mildew, and the silence was broken only by their careful breaths and the faint sound of something, a scraping, or a dragging far beyond the reach of their light. Halfway down the passage, beneath a mound of rat-chewed paper and brittle cloth, they found a brooch crusted with grime, the initials R.H. etched on the back. Rosalind Havisham, missing since 1983, presumed dead, but never found. Next to it, wrapped in what appeared to be a torn strip of nursery curtain, was a small cloth doll with glass eyes, its head twisted at an unnatural angle, and a smear of something dried and reddish near the mouth. No body, no blood, but the space had the unmistakable stillness of a place that had known suffering. Mrs. Ellery said nothing, only straightened and turned her torch to the wall, where beneath the grime she traced a network of brass piping, thin and curling like veins behind the plaster. Not plumbing, not modern, at least, something older, meant for sound, not water. Later, while the warden phoned the authorities, she moved quietly to her late husband's study, where she remembered reading of a whisper system once used in large homes to call between floors. Her fingers traced the floorboards until she found the vent, small, round, with its grill painted over but not sealed. When she knelt and placed her ear against it, she heard it again. A voice, impossibly close, whispering not words but syllables that sounded like names. Not ghosts, people. Someone had learned to move through the hollow bones of the house, to speak without being seen, to haunt not with chains or shadows but with knowledge. And knowledge in a place like Rosewood House, where half the tenants held pasts they never spoke of, was more dangerous than any spectre. Mrs. Ellery stood, straightened her shawl and closed the vent with care. This was not a matter for the constables or the clergy. This was a matter of design, of someone who understood how old houses remember, how they breathe, and how they speak. And someone was speaking again, not to frighten but to threaten. The house had not forgotten the missing girl, the locked rooms, or the crooked family trees that stretched into silence, and now neither would she. The hush of Briarstone House was thick with a kind of breathless anticipation, as if the old walls themselves were holding secrets in their lungs, waiting for the right ear to lean close. Rain battered the stained glass windows in erratic rhythms, casting fractured hues across the threadbare carpet and the tarnished brass fittings of the drawing room. Miss Lydia Wren stood unmoving at the fireplace, a thin roll of paper clutched tightly in her gloved hand. A maintenance schematic dated 1892, pulled not from any archive, but from the hollow back of a locked cabinet in the East Library, hidden behind a false panel that had only given way when she'd leaned too hard, chasing the faint but distinct scent of lavender and pipe smoke. Her breath caught as she traced the lines on the parchment, routes and shafts deliberately omitted from modern blueprints, a network of servant corridors and sound shafts that wove unseen through the house like veins feeding a sleeping beast. They converged deliberately beneath the old conservatory, a place long sealed after the fire of 1938, where plants once bloomed out of season, and a strange warmth had lingered long after the embers cooled. Clara, Lydia realized, hadn't been imagining things. The voice she heard, soft, intimate, deliberate, had spoken through these channels not to haunt, but to guide, to awaken something buried beneath decades of rehearsed history. Clara hadn't lost her mind, she had merely tuned into a frequency meant only for her. And now, as Lydia stood in the gutted chamber below the house, lantern flickering against walls streaked with soot and time, she could feel the same pull, a presence not spectral, but strategic. The room was not empty. An old phonograph, its needle snapped but the vinyl stack beside it pristine, sat beneath a velvet curtain. Behind it rows of rusted pipes emerged from the wall, sound tunnels, cleverly disguised. And at the center on a marble pedestal, a journal rested, open to a final page written in a jagged hand, "They made me forget. But the house remembers, listen." Beside it lay a child's locket, untouched by dust, containing two photographs, one of Lady Eleanor Hartwell, and the other of a girl with Lydia's eyes, but younger, dressed in a red coat. Lydia had never owned. The constable beside her said nothing, but his face had paled, his breath shallow. Upstairs the manor groaned softly, as if shifting beneath the weight of resurfacing truths. Confronting Halcroft, the estate's appointed historian and executor, Lydia saw the mask finally slip when she repeated a line Clara had once scribbled on the back of a nursery rhyme, "Play your part, or be replaced." Halcroft's confession didn't come in words so much as in the tremor of his glass, the crack in his voice when he muttered, "You were never supposed to find that room." His tale spilled like oil, dark, slick, and hard to grasp. Clara had uncovered discrepancies in the family line, photographs that didn't match records, a girl who appeared in every frame but none of the written accounts. That girl, Halcroft admitted, wasn't Clara's obsession, she was Lydia herself. Clara had pieced together what no one else dared question, that the Hartwell legacy had been rewritten, the true heir hidden in plain sight, raised among the staff, her memories curated by those tasked with keeping her ignorant. The whispering through the walls hadn't been ghostly torment, it had been a carefully composed symphony of recovery, designed to trigger recognition, to return what had been stolen without alerting those who profited from the theft. Clara had gotten too close. And when Lydia pressed further, Halcroft said something that haunted her more than any spectre could. Briarstone doesn't haunt the living, it remembers the truth, and it whispers to those ready to hear it. As dawn broke over the rain-soaked moors, Lydia stood alone in the conservatory ruins, locket in hand, the truth now louder than silence. She was no longer just a guest in this house, she was its daughter, its memory reborn, and its reckoning had only just begun. The storm had passed, but Blackthorn Grange remained cloaked in a silence, too deliberate to be called peace. The kind of hush that settles only when secrets have begun to stir beneath old floorboards and forgotten walls. Inspector Alara Shaw stood in the shadowed drawing room, its velvet drapes drawn back, just enough to let in the grey light of dawn, her gloved hands cradling a photograph she'd retrieved from a hidden panel behind Lady Ravencourt's long unused escritoire, an image faded by time yet chillingly vivid in its implications. In it, a woman reclined in a meadow, overgrown with yarrow and nettles, her body curved protectively around the fullness of pregnancy, her expression a mixture of serenity and sorrow. But it was the man standing beside her, dressed in the subdued livery of a domestic servant, who arrested Alara's focus. He stood rigid, one hand behind his back, yet his eyes weren't for the camera, they were locked with fierce intimacy on the woman at his side. Younger, unlined, but unmistakable. It was Callum Finch, the current steward of Blackthorn Grange, the same man who had insisted again and again that he'd served the Ravencourt family with nothing but distance and propriety. The lie fell apart in Alara's mind like moth-eaten lace. Now, the fragments of this case, once disjointed and cryptic, fell into sinister alignment. The West Wing sealed for 2 decades under the pretense of illness, Lady Ravencourt's abrupt and unexplained disappearance from public life. The erratic alterations to the estate's trust, the mysterious letters signed only with a single R, and the sudden coincidental arrival of a young woman named Rosalind Whitcomb, whose connection to the estate was dismissed as baseless. The photograph, this single fragile relic, breathed life into the past, and revealed a far darker story than any whispered ghost tale. Alara turned slowly, facing the parlor's inhabitants, their eyes avoiding hers like guilty children. Callum stood by the hearth, posture frozen, the flames casting grotesque shadows over his carefully neutral face. Beatrice Vale, the former companion, sat clasping her teacup with trembling fingers she could no longer steady. Reverend Dunn gazed upward, as if divine intervention might descend and relieve him of the moment's weight, and Mrs. Halbert, the housekeeper of 30 years, stood near the threshold like a sentinel, her face unreadable, but her eyes sharp with withheld memory. Alara's voice was gentle, but every word carried like the chime of a distant clock, inevitable and deliberate. She didn't accuse, she remembered aloud. She spoke of Lady Ravenscourt, not as a madwoman, but as a mother, not as a ghost, but as a prisoner of silence, condemned not by illness, but by those who feared the consequences of her defiance. She had loved a servant, and worse in the eyes of her peers, she had borne his child. In a house ruled by legacy and lineage, such a transgression had been unthinkable. Lord Ravenscourt had acted swiftly, cruelly. Callum was dismissed with forged accusations, and Lady Ravenscourt was placed under constant watch, her correspondence restricted, her will rewritten under coercion. Yet, the lady had not gone quietly into the oubliette they had crafted for her. Before she was locked away, she had written a second secret will, a detailed diary hidden in compartments within her writing desk, letters to the child she was forced to surrender. She left behind more than paper, she left echoes. The whispers that had haunted the staff for years weren't supernatural. They came from the manor's network of servant vents, pipes that once carried voices, now used by someone who had discovered their function, and turned them into instruments of dread. Someone who wanted the truth exhumed. Rosalind's arrival had not been random. Drawn by a pull she couldn't name, she'd stumbled upon a series of letters embedded within the wall of her attic bedroom, letters signed in Lady Ravenscourt's hand, filled with longing, with apology, with veiled instructions. Rosalind was not an orphan of chance, she was the child. And that revelation threatened not just inheritance but identity. Callum, now a man respected in the village, had built a new life on a grave of silence, and the resurrection of the truth threatened to reduce it all to ash. As Alara laid the photograph on the table before them, the room seemed to recoil. Mrs. Halbert let out a small, almost inaudible sound, something between a sigh and a sob, and even the fire seemed to flicker in dismay. "Did you think the past wouldn't find its way back?" Alara asked, her voice a soft blade. Callum didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was the final confession. In Blackthorn Grange it was not the dead who haunted. It was the truth, starved for too long, now returned not for vengeance, but for acknowledgement. And as the storm clouds cleared beyond the frost-streaked windows, the house finally exhaled, because the reckoning had arrived, and it had a name. The manor at Elmswick had long stood like a mausoleum of forgotten truths, its windows forever fogged, its corridors echoing not with footsteps but with memories too stubborn to die. Ivy had devoured its stone walls like guilt-swallowing legacy, and beneath its grand chandeliers and rotting wallpaper, something ancient stirred, not quite living, not quite dead. Lenora Vale arrived not with triumph, but with trepidation, clutching a letter that named her heir to an estate she had never seen, signed by a woman whose name she barely remembered, a great-aunt erased from family stories like a stain best scrubbed clean. The house welcomed her not with warmth but with cold stillness, the kind that listens, the kind that judges. Strange things began almost immediately. The clocks in each room ticked out of sync, locked doors opened themselves, and at night, she could hear footsteps from the ceiling, though there were no rooms above her. Her dreams grew restless, images of a crying girl trapped behind the fireplace, of voices hissing from beneath the floor, of hands not her own, reaching for keys she did not remember finding. No one in the village truly spoke of Elmswick, only around it, as if to invoke its name directly might wake something best left buried. Elias Gray, the ever-watchful caretaker, moved through the halls like a man walking through his own past, eyes too quick to shift, smile too rehearsed. He claimed the fire had destroyed all legal records a decade ago, but his version of the story changed subtly each time he told it. The housemaid, Sylvie, never met Lenora's gaze. She only ever entered rooms that Lenora had just left, as if afraid to witness something. But it was Miss Aldwyn, the village historian with a reputation for unearthing that which others preferred to forget, who first suspected the weight Lenora carried wasn't delusion, but inheritance of a darker kind. The original will, signed and sealed, had left the estate not to Lenora, but to the illegitimate daughter of Lady Eleanora, a child erased by scandal and shame, whispered of, in corners and then silenced completely. That child, they now realized, had lived hidden, perhaps adopted into another name. And Lenora's great-aunt had tried in her final days to restore what history had stolen, but someone with everything to lose, had found out. As Lenora dug deeper, the house seemed to resist. Her room would rearrange itself overnight, the garden path she walked would shift directions. Her reflection in the tall hall mirror once blinked when she did not. Then one night, she disappeared. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, just silence. It was Miss Aldwyn who, with growing dread and her hand clenched around the last remaining blueprint of Elmswick's original foundation, traced a forgotten corridor sealed behind the eastern wing. She remembered an odd mention in the diary of a servant from 1903, a tunnel used by Lady Eleanora to pass unseen through the house when her shame grew too heavy. The constable scoffed until the third floorboard was pulled up, and a hollow space answered with air stale and cold. Behind the bricks, they found a door, sealed tight, reinforced, buried beneath time. Inside, crumpled in the dust and cobwebs, barely alive, was Lenora. Her lips cracked, her eyes sunken, she whispered one name, not Elias, not Sylvie, but Eleanor. The disinherited child, whose blood it turned out ran in both Elias and Lenora. The truth was tangled in generations of fear, and Elias, whose father had been the disowned bastard of the family, had lived his life inside Elmswick not to serve, but to suppress. He had sealed Lenora away, not with violence, but with manipulation. A lie about an attic key, a story of a family relic lost in the eastern wing. She had gone willingly, and then the door had closed behind her. No food, no light, only the past, only the truth. Miss Aldwyn knelt beside her as the rescue team brought Lenora into the sun. The house, once heavy with silence, now seemed to exhale, but not in relief, in warning. Because Elmswick was not done. Houses like this, built on lies, and maintained by generations of fear, never truly stop whispering. They wait, and sometimes, when they find someone strong enough to listen, they speak again, struck not merely by confinement, but by a silence that had grown so thick it felt like it was stitched into her skin. Marianne Whitlow was found beneath Thornfield Grange, curled within the damp stone womb of a forgotten root cellar, where the air hung heavy with mildew, dust, and the slow decay of time. Her discovery was not dramatic, but uncanny, like the unsealing of something sacred and sorrowful. When Constable Reeve, following a lead no one else took seriously, heard a sound that wasn't quite a cry, but not quite silence either. When they lifted her from that darkness, her limbs trembled not just from hunger or thirst, but from the terror that had learned to live inside her bones. Her eyes, ringed with shadows, and yet burning with life, scanned the corridor of Thornfield, not as a stranger to it, but as someone who had once run laughing through it as a child, before those halls turned traitor. Whether Gregory Fenwick, her guardian in name only, had intended her death, or merely her silence remained uncertain. But his attempt to flee across the moor under the cover of fog, with only a valise and forged documents, had said enough. The villagers, once complicit in their indifference, watched from behind curtains as he was escorted away, coat askew, face pale, a man who had gambled with a soul and lost. Inside the house no grand scene awaited Marianne, only Mrs. Ives, the stalwart housekeeper, whose heart had never quite hardened despite decades of duty, who wrapped her in a heavy wool shawl that smelled of lavender and old starch, and brewed tea with the patience of someone who understood that certain wounds aren't spoken to, only sat with. There was no rush to speak, no pressure to recount horrors. The crackle of the fire, the rattle of the kettle, and the muted ticking of the clock were the only sounds that filled the drawing-room now, as if Thornfield itself held its breath, ashamed of what had happened within its walls. Marianne sipped slowly, her hands shaking slightly as though they hadn't quite remembered what warmth felt like, her gaze flicking often to the corners of the room where shadows still lingered like memories unwilling to leave. Yet she didn't cry, not once, not when the constables left, not when her inheritance was confirmed, not even when the Reverend offered a soft-spoken apology for having believed Gregory's convenient tales of her mental instability. Mrs. Ives stayed close, never hovering, but never far, placing lemon slices just so in her cup and adjusting the shawl when it slipped. Later, Marianne stood at the threshold of the study, staring at the desk where Gregory had signed false deeds and hidden codicils, documents that were now hers, legally and righteously so. Solicitor Hargrave, who had once dismissed her claims as fantasy, now spoke with uncharacteristic deference, unspooling a tale of fraud and betrayal that only confirmed what she had always known, but never been allowed to prove. And yet she said little, not out of fear, but because her silence now carried weight. She walked through Thornfield with slow reverence, touching the carved banisters, the faded tapestries, the cracked windows, as if reacquainting herself with a place that had known her once and nearly killed her later. By week's end, not only had the will been authenticated and the estate rightfully restored, but so too had the quiet authority in her posture. No longer did she flinch at echoing footsteps, or the sudden creak of wood. She slept with the door open. She lit candles in rooms long sealed off. She even reopened the greenhouse, where her mother once tended jasmine in the mornings before scandal and whispers overtook everything. On the 7th evening, as twilight bled into the sky, and the crows began their circling, Marianne sat by the bay window and wrote to her cousin Eliza, not to explain, not to accuse, but simply to say, "I survived. The house is mine now. It remembers me." She sealed the letter with wax the color of blood, and watched as the last rays of sunlight touched the roof tiles that had once trembled with her screams. Thornfield Grange had been a tomb, a cage, a silent witness to a crime no one wanted to see. But now, under her quiet, unblinking gaze, it had begun, slowly, stubbornly, to become something else, not just a house, but a place reclaimed. Outside, the wind shifted, and within the old bones of the building, something ancient seemed to exhale, not a breath of fear, but of recognition. When Evelyn stepped through the iron gates of Rosegrave Manor, it was not just a return to a house, but a reckoning with shadows long suppressed. The wind was still, as if the very air held its breath, and the hedges lining the gravel path leaned inward like silent sentinels bearing witness to unspoken truths. The house loomed as always, its facade untouched by time, yet deeply marked by memory. Windows blind with dust, ivy strangling the southern wall, and that heavy oak door that creaked like a sigh of recognition as it opened to her touch. Inside, nothing had moved. Furniture sat draped in thin veils of dust, and the chandelier above the foyer swayed gently without cause, as if disturbed by an unseen presence. But Evelyn didn't flinch. Her fingers grazed the banister, her eyes absorbing every frame, every scuff on the wooden floorboards that once echoed with her mother's footsteps. She had come not for revenge, but for answers, a fragile, desperate need to piece together the fragments that had been buried in whispers and sealed with guilt. The drawing room held the first clue, a repaired portrait of her mother, Eleanor, once slashed in a fit of rage, now restored with delicate brushwork by someone too ashamed to let it remain defaced. But it was the cellar where truth waited, coiled and breathless. A single candle flickered on a forgotten shelf, though no one had lit it in years. Behind a false panel, Evelyn found it, a rusted biscuit tin wrapped in tattered linen. Inside, her mother's diary, brittle but legible, pages filled with a handwriting that trembled between terror and love. "If Evelyn ever finds this, she'll know I tried." One entry read, and another more desperate. "They promised silence would keep her safe, but lies only grow teeth. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from recognition. Names spilled from the pages. Victor Hallowell, her godfather, her protector, the man who taught her how to tie her shoes and wipe her tears, had silenced Eleanor to protect his own sins. And not once, but twice. The diary spoke of another girl, long before Evelyn, who had vanished under unfortunate circumstances and been written off as a runaway. But Eleanor had seen, and for that she was made to disappear. The truth, once unearthed, did not come quietly. That night, doors creaked open without touch. The grandfather clock struck 3:17, the exact time her mother had vanished, though it had been broken for years. Whispers echoed from empty rooms, and Evelyn saw in flashes reflections that weren't hers, shadows that moved when she didn't. Yet, fear didn't claim her. Instead, she began restoring not just the house but the narrative. She repainted the nursery, removed every mirror from the west wing, sealed the servants' passage with bricks, and every evening she placed white lilies on the staircase, her mother's favorite. Victor, confronted only by Evelyn's knowing silence, left the village days later, his departure so quiet it was almost spectral. No one asked why, no one needed to. The village had always known, but Evelyn stayed. She didn't chase headlines or write memoirs. She tended the overgrown garden with her mother's shears. She lit candles in every room her mother once smiled in, and she spoke to the house, not to summon, but to soothe. And over time the house changed. The air lightened, the cold spots warmed. The nursery no longer felt like a tomb but a cradle for healing. And in the stillness, Evelyn whispered, "I heard you, Mama, I heard it all." The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of peace. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of rest. The ghosts had not left. They had been acknowledged, and acknowledgement, Evelyn knew, was more powerful than exorcism. Rosegrave Manor would never be the same. It wasn't meant to be. It had been reborn not through exorcism, but by memory reclaimed and truth honored. Evelyn, once a forgotten daughter in the pages of others' lies, had become the keeper of her family's real story. And as the robins returned to the birdbath, and the roses finally bloomed in the place where thorns once ruled, Evelyn sat by the hearth with her mother's diary and murmured, "This is home now, and it remembers." Outside the wind shifted gently, and the manor at last slept. Perhaps the walls of Blackthorn Grange will never truly speak, but by now we've learned that some houses don't need to utter a word for their truths to be heard. The silence itself becomes a language of sighing floorboards, flickering candle shadows, and doors that close themselves half a second too late. What was uncovered here was never just a puzzle to be solved, or a culprit to be named. It was a reckoning with time itself. A wound, hidden beneath generations of dust and denial, finally allowed to bleed clean in the open air. And yet, even now, as the echoes begin to settle, we ask what remains. What memories still hover in the hollow hush of that long hallway, where the grandfather clock ticks 2 minutes too slow? What names remain unspoken in the letters never posted, tucked behind loose bricks in the chimney, or beneath warped floorboards under the attic stairs? We ask you now, the fellow listener, the observer of the unseen, what truths do you believe were left behind? Which thread, if tugged, might unravel the story still further? We welcome your thoughts, your questions, and your quiet suspicions in the comments, because sometimes the greatest insight comes not from the detective, but from the eyes watching in silence. If this journey through faded wallpapers and candlelit revelations stirred something within you, a chill, a question, or the faint thrill of recognition, stay with us. Subscribe to continue walking these narrow corridors of human nature, where guilt wears pearls, and secrets hide in lace-draped mirrors. Share this tale with someone who still believes that justice can arrive quietly, like the turning of a page or the placing of a teacup on a saucer. Someone who understands that the past never truly dies, it waits, patient and breathless, for the moment someone dares to listen. And until we meet again in another story, another manor, another long-forgotten whisper carried through locked rooms and candle smoke, keep your eyes sharp, your questions sharper, and above all keep your heart open. Because in the end, it is not always ghosts who haunt us, but the truths we bury too deep. and the echoes we refused to answer.